Since 1980, the quantity of clothing purchased by the average individual has increased 5 times, while the proportion of income spent on clothing has somehow dropped dramatically despite that.
This has largely been made possible by the rise of so-called fast fashion retailers such as H&M, Zara, and Canada's own Joe Fresh, who have made trendy clothing cheaper than ever and cheap clothing trendier than ever.
Despite these rock-bottom prices, these brands continue to bring billions of dollars a year in profit. But how do they pull this off?
Outsourcing. Since the 1980s, fashion retailers have shifted their labor force from developed countries with strong workplace safety regulations and minimum wages, such as Canada, to countries with cheaper labor and near non-existent workplace regulations overseas. As a result, just 30% of clothing sold in Canada today is made in Canada, compared to 70% in 1980.
So, why should you care? When you pick up that new dress at H&M, there's more to that dress than just the style and the price. There are sacrifices that were made to make that low number on that price tag possible. My name is Yan, and along with my partner Eric, we'll be discussing the unjust working conditions in the textile industry.
As the fashion industry has moved to shift manufacturing to overseas countries such as Bangladesh and Cambodia, regulations in those countries have failed to keep up.
A recent Human Rights Watch report reveals that conditions in these countries are beyond poor. They're often criminally abusive. These workers often suffer from malnutrition and are subjected to excessive heat, long hours, and stiff quotas. Working conditions often ignore the little safety regulations already in place. The factories that these workers are packed into are often equipped with poor electrical wiring, dangerous carcinogens, and fail to meet basic building regulations.
Clothing brands have repeatedly been called out on human rights violations. For example, take Gap. Factories manufacturing Gap clothing were found to be overworking employees on a regular basis in 1995, and half a year later were found to be employing underage workers.
But in response, Gap agreed to institute independent monitoring of the conditions in their factories.
Yes, and then Gap clothing was once again found being made in factories employing and overworking underage workers in 2015. And in a separate instance, a fire broke out in a factory producing Gap clothing in 2012.
To which they promised to launch a fire and building safety plan.
Yet CBS News found factories unequipped with fire extinguishers after they were supposed to have implemented such protocols. Then, in 2013, the worst possible consequences of these cost-cutting actions was seen when Rana Plaza, a 5-story commercial building which held 5,000 garment workers, collapsed. Over 1,100 workers died, with over 2,500 injured. Among the debris of the disaster, garments carrying tags from major brands such as Joe Fresh and Children's Place were found. The disaster could have been avoidable, however, as workers had discovered cracks in the building the day before, but the building owners ignored the warnings to avoid the building.
Rihanna, one of the victims of the collapse, was reluctant to go to work the morning of the incident. As a result of the incident, both of her legs were amputated, and she was confined to a wheelchair and struggles not only financially, but also with depression, anxiety, and separation from her family, having been forced to move to a rehabilitation center.
As consumers, however, there is justice in the choices that we're able to make. Immediately following the incident, the brands that had been manufacturing clothing in the factory, and the fashion industry as a whole, faced public outcry over the neglect of factory conditions. Many petitions circulated online urging companies to hold their suppliers to higher safety standards, and many urged others to boycott the fast fashion brands whom had a hand in creating the conditions for the collapse.
As a result, companies such as Joe Fresh and over 200 other clothing companies signed on to the Accord of Fire and Building Safety in Bangladesh, a legally binding agreement that closely tracks factory safety upgrades in the country and issues quarterly reports. Since this was implemented in 2013, the number of fires at garment factories in Bangladesh are down by almost 90% since the incident.
Today, years after the incident, the outrage from the collapse has been forgotten, and these companies continue to produce clothes in overseas countries. While conditions have improved dramatically due to public outcry, reports of dangerous working conditions, long hours, wage theft, and so on continue to appear in Bangladesh, as well as other countries where the accord doesn't apply.
Fashion brands are repeatedly caught neglecting workplace conditions in their factories, but always get off scot-free after the initial outcry subsides.
As consumers, it is important for us to sustain the pressure on these companies to uphold basic safety standards throughout their supply chains. Next time you go shopping, consider the human costs attached to the price of the clothes you're buying. Favor brands such as Everlane, Matt & Nat, or Levi's, who have committed themselves to transparent and sustainable supply chain management and initiatives to ensure workers' well-being, and think twice about buying from fast fashion giants that have repeatedly violated labor laws.